The Conclave of 12 Suns had never smelled like anything a human would enjoy. It was the breath of 1,000 civilizations compressed into one orbital station, sulfur from the Vreth delegation, brine from the Aquari, something that smelled disturbingly like burning hair from the Zethkai exhaust ports. Commander Darian Cole stood at the outer rim of the Grand Assembly Hall and breathed through his mouth, the way soldiers learn to breathe in places that remind them they are outsiders. He was the only human in the room. That was not an accident. The Terran Accord had fought for 37 years to earn a single seat at the Conclave. Not a vote, not a voice, a seat, an observer's chair pressed against the back wall where the species that mattered wouldn't have to look at it. Darian had accepted the chair without complaint. He was 34 years old, lean in the way that space travel makes a man lean, muscles stripped to function, fat a luxury the body stops carrying. His uniform was Terran gray, plain against the jeweled robes and bioluminescent armor of the other delegates. No rank insignia. The Accord had been advised, diplomatically, that displaying military symbols might make the older races uncomfortable. He had left his medals at the ship. The assembly hall was a sphere of curved white stone, grown, not built, from the calcified coral of a dead ocean world, and it held the delegates of 61 civilizations in tiered rings that descended toward a central platform. The architecture was a statement. The center was for those who mattered. The outer rings were for everyone else. Darian sat in the last ring, so far from the center that he had to use his earpiece to translate what was being said. Today's session was about the Keth incursion, a fringe conflict that had already consumed 4 colony systems and was spreading toward the inner trade lanes. The Keth were not intelligent in the way the Conclave defined intelligence. They were something older and stranger, a hive consciousness born from a dying star, capable of consuming technology and adapting it within hours. 3 civilizations had tried to fight them with conventional fleets. 3 civilizations had stopped existing afterward. Darian had read every available report on the Keth. He had read them twice. He had also written a 40-page strategic analysis and submitted it to the Conclave's secretariat. It had been logged, filed, and ignored in that order. He was aware of this. He said nothing about it. The debate on the central platform was being led, or more accurately, performed, by Princess Seraphine Velamara of the Ethon Dominion. She was the reason half the delegates had bothered to attend in person. The Ethon were the oldest spacefaring civilization in recorded history, their empire spanning 47 star systems, their biology refined over 6 million years of directed evolution into something that most species instinctively responded to as beautiful and slightly frightening at the same time. Seraphine was tall by human standards, though the Ethon would have said humans had no standards worth measuring by. Her skin held a faint luminescence, not bioluminescent in any mechanical sense, but the natural result of a subcutaneous chromatophore layer that responded to emotion and intent. When she was pleased, she glowed. When she was angry, the light went cold and blue. Right now, she was a pale gold, the color of controlled authority, and her voice moved through the hall like something that had practiced being listened to for 10,000 years. The solution, she was saying, is overwhelming force applied by civilizations that possess the capacity to deliver it. The Ethon Dominion commits 40 warships. We call upon the Vreth Collective, the Murran Federation, and the Quilith Compact to match that commitment. Together, we eliminate the Keth threat in one decisive engagement. Applause, or what passed for applause among species that communicated in frequencies Darian's ears could only partially detect. He watched and waited and said nothing. It was the junior Ethon attaché who noticed him first, a young male with the slightly overbright eyes of someone whose job was to notice things his superiors couldn't be bothered to notice. He leaned toward Seraphine and said something. She turned, and her gaze found the human in the last ring the way a lighthouse finds a fishing boat, accidentally, without interest, and already moving on. Then she paused. She looked at him again, with the particular attention of someone who has just been told something they find mildly amusing. "I see we have a Terran observer," she said, loud enough that her translator carried it through the hall. I was not aware the Accord had sent a representative. How appropriate that they chose to attend a discussion of actual warfare. She smiled, and it was a smile that had 6 million years of practice behind it. Perhaps the WHO man would like to offer a perspective. I understand your species has been spacefaring for, what is it now, 200 years? 214, Darian said. His translator carried it clearly. 214. She let the number sit in the air like an exhibit. The Ethon have been navigating the stars for longer than your species has had written language. But please, share your thoughts. I would not want our newest members to feel excluded. The hall's ambient sound shifted. Something that Darian's combat instincts recognized as the specific frequency of a crowd that expects someone to be humiliated. He stood. He did not rush, did not adjust his collar, did not do any of the small things people do when they're suddenly aware of being watched. He had stood in front of bomb disposal situations, hostile alien first contacts, and one very bad debrief with an admiral who later apologized. He had learned something important in each of those situations. The person who controls their breathing controls the room. Your plan will fail, he said. The gold light on Seraphine's skin flickered. Excuse me. The 40 warships, the combined fleet, the decisive engagement. He paused just long enough. It will fail, and the failure will cost you 60% casualties in the first engagement, after which the Keth will have adapted to every weapons system you've committed. You'll have taught them how to kill you while losing most of your capacity to respond. Silence. Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of crystal, genuinely musical, genuinely contemptuous. And the human strategist, she said, who has been spacefaring for 2 centuries would propose what exactly? A strongly worded communication, a petition. More laughter, from the Vreth, from the Murren, from a Quilith delegate whose species had 3 mouths and used all of them. Darian sat down. He did not explain. He did not argue. He made a note in his personal log, retrieved his 40-page analysis from his bag, and wrote one additional line at the top of the document. Projected outcome of current Conclave strategy, exactly as stated above. Recommend Terran withdrawal from support operations until Conclave solicits revised approach. He sent it to the Secretariat a second time, with a timestamp. Then he folded his hands and waited for the Ethon to discover what 214 years of fighting to survive had taught the smallest, youngest, most mocked species in the known galaxy. He did not have to wait long. The Battle of Velserath was not televised. The Conclave didn't broadcast its military engagements. It was considered undignified, the sort of thing younger civilizations did. But the after-action data was public record, and Darian had been watching the feeds from his ship with the calm, focused attention of a man who already knows the ending of the story he's reading. The Ethon fleet engaged the Keth at the Velserath debris field on the 14th day after the assembly session. 43 warships. They'd added 3 additional vessels, Darian noted, probably because someone had decided more was better. Seraphine herself had commanded from the flagship, which told him she was either genuinely brave or had never faced an enemy that learned while it fought. The first engagement lasted 9 minutes. In those 9 minutes, the Ethon lost 11 ships. Not damaged, not disabled. Consumed, the Keth method of acquisition was to overwhelm a hull's structural integrity fields, then absorb the wreckage directly into their mass, reading its technology, its weapons configurations, its power signatures, all of it in real time. 11 ships in 9 minutes meant the Keth now understood Ethon plasma cannons, shield harmonics, and navigation architecture. They used that understanding in the second engagement, 4 hours later. Darian was on a secure communication with Terran Command when the second battle data came through. He was giving a briefing. He did not stop the briefing. He simply pulled up the feed on a secondary screen and kept talking, because the ability to process 2 things at once was not a superpower. It was what happened when a species spent 200 years being outnumbered. The core problem, he was saying to the holographic faces of the Joint Chiefs, is that the Conclave is fighting the Keth the way every other civilization has fought every other war, overwhelming force applied at a single point. That works against enemies that can be exhausted, demoralized, or outproduced. The Keth don't get exhausted. They don't have morale, and they don't need production time because they are the production line. General Aisha Tambali, a compact woman with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent 40 years not being wrong about things that mattered, leaned forward. You've had this analysis ready. Since week 2 of the Conclave says. Sion. They didn't listen. They will, he paused. They've lost 19 ships now. The faces on the call were quiet for a moment. Tambali spoke. What do you need? 2 Terran rapid response squadrons. No heavy cruisers. The Keth will absorb their architecture, and it'll take us months to develop a counter. I want small craft. Fast, low signature, expendable in ways we can afford. And I need authorization to operate independently of Conclave command structure. That'll require diplomatic cover. I know, he had already drafted the request. It's in your queue. Tambali looked at someone off screen. Something was communicated that Darian wasn't meant to see, but he caught the micro-expression, approval, with a note of something like parental exasperation. He had been producing these micro-expressions in superior officers since he was 22. Approved, she said. Don't embarrass us. I never do, he said. It was not a boast. It was a data point. The call ended. Darian turned to the secondary screen. Second engagement. Final tally, 9 additional Ethon ships lost. The flagship had taken structural damage and withdrawn. The Keth had expanded their territory by another 0.3 light-years. He sent a request to the Conclave Secretariat for an emergency session. He also sent a personal message to Princess Seraphine's diplomatic office. He had learned, early in his posting, that formal channels and personal channels worked differently in the Conclave's culture. Formal channels were for decisions that had already been made. Personal channels were for decisions that were about to be. He addressed the message through the correct protocol, precisely measured, nothing aggressive, nothing that could be read as gloating. It said, in full, I believe the situation may benefit from a conversation before the next session. Commander Darian Cole, Terran Accord Observer. I remain available. He did not expect a quick response. She replied in 40 minutes. He found that interesting. They met in one of the Conclave station's secondary conference rooms, small by galactic diplomatic standards, which meant it was roughly the size of a ballroom by human standards. The ceilings were high. The walls were that same grown coral white, and the light came from bioluminescent strips that the station's original architects had installed because they were Ethon, and they had always built their important spaces to feel like the inside of something alive. Seraphine arrived with 2 bodyguards and an aide. She had changed from her assembly robes into something that Darian's cultural briefings identified as Ethon informal attire, still worth more than his ship's fuel budget, but an indication that this was not an official meeting. She was still luminous. The gold was slightly less controlled now, flickering at the edges into something cooler. She was angry, he understood, but she had come. You said you wanted a conversation, she said, without preamble, without the assembly's theatrical cadence. Her voice in person was different, lower, less performed. The implication being that you have something worth saying that you were unable to say in the assembly. I said everything worth saying in the assembly, Darian replied. You weren't ready to hear it then. The bodyguards shifted slightly. The aide made a note. Seraphine studied him with the focused attention of someone who had spent millennia reading the subtle biological signals of dozens of species and was currently having difficulty categorizing what she was seeing. You're not apologizing, she observed. No. Most species apologize when they've offended an Ethon. I know, he waited a beat. I also know that the Keth have now absorbed enough Ethon weapons technology to neutralize your next fleet action before it begins, so I thought you might find directness more useful than courtesy right now. The gold light on her skin pulsed once, surprise, he guessed, though he was working from limited data, and then settled into something more curious. She sat. Her bodyguards did not. Explain the Keth to me, she said. Not what the reports say, what you think. He sat across from her and did something he rarely did in professional contexts. He took a breath and let himself think out loud. The Keth aren't a military problem, he said. They're an evolutionary one. Every species that's fought them has approached them as an enemy to defeat. But the Keth don't experience defeat. They experience input. Every ship they destroy becomes information. Every weapon fired at them is a lesson. Fighting them with your best technology is the worst possible strategy because you're essentially giving them a tutorial. She was listening, really listening. He could tell because the ambient gold had gone almost still, the way very attentive people go still when they are processing something that challenges a foundational assumption. Then what is the correct straw? Teji, she asked. You fight them with your worst technology, he said. You fight them with things they've already seen. You fight them with chaos and noise and unpredictability, not because it will destroy them, but because it will confuse them. And while they're confused, you use that window to hit what actually matters. Which is? He pulled up a holographic display from his wrist unit, Terran made, significantly less elegant than the Ethon equivalent, significantly more durable. A map of the Keth expansion corridor appeared in the air between them. The Keth mass, he said. The hive core, it's not one location, it's a distributed consciousness, but it has nodes, processing centers. Every time it absorbs new information, it routes that information through specific nodes to integrate it. Those nodes have a biological refresh cycle. He highlighted 3 points on the map. During integration, they're vulnerable, not to weapons, to signal disruption. Seraphine leaned forward slightly. How did you find the nodes? We lost people finding the nodes, he said. It came out flat, not theatrical. 7 scout teams, 41 personnel. It took us 2 years of operation in the Keth expansion zone to map the pattern. He paused. We started running reconnaissance the week the Keth incursion began. We didn't wait for the Conclave to ask. Her gaze sharpened. You've been operating in Keth space for 2 years without Conclave authorization. We've been observing in Keth space, he said carefully. Terran Accord has independent jurisdiction over its own vessels. We didn't enter Conclave-designated conflict zones. A beat. We entered the zones before they were designated. She sat back. The gold light shifted into something he hadn't seen yet, still cool, but with a warmth at the edges that might have been reassessment. Or irritation. He couldn't tell. You let 41 people die, she said slowly, to gather data. They were soldiers, he said. They chose the mission, and their deaths are the reason I have a plan that might actually work. He held her gaze. What's your casualty count from the last 2 engagements, Princess? The light on her skin went very still. 4,312, she said. The theatrical quality was completely gone. This was a different voice, a real one, worn down to its grain. Crew and support personnel. I know, he said. I'm sorry. She looked at him. You say that like you mean it. I do mean it. He turned off the holographic display. I'm not here to prove I was right. I'm here because your 4,000 dead and my 41 dead all died to the same enemy, and that enemy is still out there, and I have a plan that might stop it. But I need Ethon resources to execute it. He paused. And I need you to follow my lead. That last sentence landed in the room and sat there. Seraphine looked at him for a long time. The light on her skin cycled slowly through gold and cool blue and something in between that his cultural briefing had no translation for. You are, she said finally, the most unusual creature I have met in 600 years of diplomatic service. Is that a yes? That is, she said, a consideration. It was more than he'd had this morning. There are things that 6 million years of dominance does to a civilization. It makes them excellent at certain things, patience, refinement, the accumulation of knowledge so vast it has its own weather systems. The Ethon had mapped stars that humans hadn't yet named. They had cures for diseases that hadn't evolved yet on Earth. Their art was so technically accomplished that it had developed its own evolutionary dead ends, styles so perfect that no one bothered improving them because improvement wasn't possible. But 6 million years of dominance also calcifies certain assumptions. Seraphine had spent the 3 days after their conversation doing something she had not done in a long time, genuinely examining a position she held without first assuming she was right. It was uncomfortable in the way that all honest self-examination is uncomfortable, and she understood, with a clarity she found annoying, that the discomfort was the point. She had mocked the human, in front of the assembly, with the practiced fluency of someone who had mocked lesser civilizations before, not cruelly. She was not cruel, but with the specific confident condescension of someone who assumed mockery was accurate description. The data from the 2 engagements sat in her secure files like an accusation. She requested a full briefing from Commander Cole, not through diplomatic channels, personally. He arrived at her quarters on time to the minute, carrying a data chip and a cup of something hot that he had apparently made himself, because the station's food synthesis units had a Terran interface that he'd clearly already located and configured. He offered her the cup. She did not drink it, boo. Tea, she found the gesture, the casual, undemonstrative extension of hospitality, unexpectedly difficult to categorize. "The operation has 3 phases, he said, after she had indicated he should begin. He didn't use a presentation display. He talked, and she listened, and she understood that this was how he thought linearly, with the kind of confidence that doesn't need props. Phase 1, we go loud. I deploy the Terran rapid response squadrons with older generation Terran weapons, things the Keth have already absorbed and mapped from earlier conflicts. We make noise, we draw their attention, we simulate a conventional assault. The Keth will begin processing what they're seeing. Standard integration protocol takes between 40 and 70 minutes. And during that window. Phase 2, 3 Ethon stealth vessels, the smallest in your fleet, approach the 3-node coordinates I identified. They don't fire weapons. They deploy signal disruptors tuned to the Keth's integration frequency. He met her eyes. I need you to trust that we've correctly identified the frequency. It took 2 years and 41 deaths to get it right. She held his gaze. And if you're wrong? Then the stealth vessels have a 56-second window to withdraw before they're absorbed. He said it plainly. I won't pretend the risk is 0. You never pretend, she said. It came out as an observation, not quite a compliment. I find it's expensive, he replied. Phase 3. While the nodes are disrupted, the Keth mass loses coherence for somewhere between 12 and 20 minutes. It won't die. It'll recover. But during that window, every ship in the combined fleet, Ethon, Terran, whoever else commits, targets the coherence field at the expansion front. He paused. We don't kill the Keth. We push them back. We buy the systems they've occupied time to evacuate. And we establish a cordon that they can't adapt to, because we shift the cordon's parameters every 72 hours. She turned the plan over in her mind the way you turn a stone over in your hand, looking for the weak edge, the place it might crack. She found several places. She said so. He answered each one, not defensively, sometimes saying, that's a real risk and here's how we mitigate it. Sometimes saying, that's a real risk and I don't have a full mitigation. We'd be accepting that margin. She found, to her bewilderment, that the second kind of answer was more convincing than the first. She had spent her entire career around advisors who told her things were manageable. She had not previously understood how exhausting that was until someone showed her the alternative. You understand, she said, when he had finished, that if I accept this plan and support it before the assembly, I am giving the Terran Accord a credibility it has not previously had in this conclave. Yes, he said. That will change the political dynamics of the Outer Ring representation. I know. You've thought about this. Since about the 3rd week of my posting here, he drank whatever was in his cup. The plan works militarily. The political dimension is a consequence, not a goal. If the Accord earns more standing through this, we'll try to use it well. He paused. But I need the Keth stopped before I can afford to think about anything else. She stood and walked to the viewport that looked out on the station's exterior skin, where the cold geometry of space pressed against the glass. 6 million years. Her species had seen civilizations rise and end. They had outlasted things that thought themselves eternal. She had never been afraid of being wrong before, because she had rarely been wrong about anything that mattered. "You'll have your 3 stealth ships," she said, "and my personal support before the assembly." She turned. "I will want full operational transparency during the mission." "You'll have it." And Cole, she used his name for the first time without rank, without the theatrical framing of the assembly. It was the Ethon equivalent of a significant concession, and she could tell from the slight tightening of his expression that he understood it. "If this works," she stopped. "When this works, I owe you an apology." "You don't," he said. "You owe the 4,000 dead a victory, that's enough." She watched him leave, and the gold light on her skin did something it had not done in a very long time. It warmed. The Terran rapid response squadrons looked like junk. That was intentional. The 12 vessels that dropped out of translation space at the edge of the Velserath field were older models, not antiques, but visibly not the cutting edge, with hull configurations the Keth's absorbed database would recognize, energy signatures well within predicted parameters. They came in hard and loud and messy, the way disorganized defenders come in when they're desperate, not the clean, coordinated vectors of a prepared assault. "The Keth Nodi," said within seconds. Darian was monitoring from the command vessel, the smallest ship he'd been able to justify as a command platform, which was still, by Terran standards, a serious piece of hardware. He watched the Keth mass begin to shift, its leading edge reorienting toward the incoming squadrons with the particular fluid grace of something that didn't have a nervous system to slow it down. "They're reading us," said Lieutenant Commander Yeva Ostrova from the tactical station. She was 29, from a mining colony in the outer belt, and she had the focused calm of someone who had grown up in an environment where carelessness had immediate consequences. 40 seconds to first contact." "Let them read," Darian said. "That's the point." The first exchange of fire was spectacular and mostly intentional. The Terran squadrons deployed older plasma pulse patterns. The Keth had absorbed this technology 3 engagements ago, and the Keth responded with adapted versions of Ethon shielding that they'd consumed from the debris of the first battle. Everything happening at the engagement front was, essentially, a conversation in a language the Keth already spoke. They were processing, cataloging, adding to the vast distributed calculation of their consciousness. Integration protocol, Darian's analysis said, 40 to 70 minutes. He was betting 40 lives on the accuracy of that window. "Stealth elements," he said into the command channel. "Status." Seraphine's voice came back, precise and unafraid. She had personally taken the lead stealth vessel. He had tried to argue against this. She had listened to his argument, acknowledged its logic, and politely declined to follow it. He had found in the past 72 hours that this was very much how she made decisions, thoroughly, without ego, and with a certainty that wasn't stubbornness but something older. "In position at Node Alpha," she said. "Node Beta and Node Gamma confirm ready." "Timing is critical. We're at 11 minutes into integration." "I understand the timing, Cole." A pause. "I also understand that I spent 6 million years getting here. I won't waste the moment." Something about that landed differently than he expected. He filed it away for later. The engagement at the front was getting messier, the Keth adapting in real time to the Terran weapons signatures, the squadrons cycling through the pre-planned countermeasures he designed specifically to require more Keth processing time. It was a conversation, but it was also a performance, and the performance was holding. 23 minutes. 30. "They're increasing absorption rate," Ostrova said. "They're ahead of projected integration speed." "By how much?" 12%. Darian calculated. If the nodes hit 20% above projection, the integration window would close before the disruptors could deploy. "Squadrons 3 and 4, execute pattern delta. Increase signature variance." Pattern delta was deliberately erratic, random-seeming weapon cycling that would force additional Keth processing. It would also increase Terran exposure. "That'll cost us," Ostrova said quietly. "I know, execute." He watched the board. 2 Terran vessels took significant damage in the next 4 minutes as the Keth engaged more directly. He felt each hit as the specific kind of ache that command carries, the knowledge that people are in danger because of choices you made in a conference room days ago. He did not look away from the board. 38 minutes. Integration rate stabilizing, Ostrova said. Back to baseline. Darian exhaled. Seraphine, execute phase 2, now. Executing. The 3 Ethon stealth vessels were invisible to human sensors and nearly invisible to Keth absorption fields. The Ethon had, over 6 million years, developed stealth technology that worked by making a ship look like background radiation rather than by hiding it, which was a distinction that had taken Darian's engineering team 6 months to understand, and that he was profoundly grateful for right now. They hit the nodes simultaneously. The signal disruptors were not weapons in any conventional sense. They broadcast on a frequency that interfered with the Keth's integration, processing the way. A sharp tone interferes with concentration, not destroying the function, but breaking the rhythm of it, creating an error cascade that forced the distributed consciousness to spend its processing power resolving internal contradictions rather than continuing integration. The effect was visible on the tactical display as a shimmer, a standing wave moving through the Keth mass like the vibration through a struck bell, radiating out from 3 points simultaneously. The Keth stopped advancing. Coherence disruption confirmed, Ostrova said, and he heard in her voice the particular relief of someone who had been professionally skeptical about a plan and is very glad to be wrong. Estim. Aided window, 14 minutes. Darian opened the combined fleet channel. All elements, this is Cole. The window is open. Targets are the coherence field coordinates in your tactical packages. You have 14 minutes, not 1 second more. He paused. Let's push them back. What followed was the most coordinated military action in the Conclave's recent history, which was not a coincidence. The Ethon were exquisite at coordinated action. Their command architecture was 6 million years old and refined to near perfection. The Vreth were brutal and direct. The Terran squadrons were fast and adaptable. Together, under a targeting framework that Darian had spent 3 days building and that he had argued, in 3 separate heated conversations with Ethon fleet commanders, should be distributed and redundant rather than hierarchical and centralized. Together, they hit the Keth expansion front across 47 points simultaneously. The Keth contracted. Not fully, not permanently, but the leading edge of the expansion pulled back, the coherence field that had been spreading outward reversing itself, the mass drawing in like something that had touched fire. The 4 occupied systems at the front of the incursion corridor showed sudden gaps, areas where the Keth presence thinned, then withdrew. 12 minutes into the window, the disruption began to fade. Stealth elements withdraw, Darian said immediately. All attack elements disengage and clear the corridor, now. The Keth recovered its coherence 2 minutes later, but it didn't advance. It held position at the new line, 3 light-years back from where it had been. The Conclave's territorial integrity feed updated. 4 systems, recovered. Darian sat in his command chair and breathed for a moment. Ostrova was doing the same thing at her station. The silence on the command deck lasted about 6 seconds before it was replaced by the controlled professionalism of people who didn't celebrate in the middle of a battlefield. Seraphine's voice came through the channel. Cole. Princess. Your analysis was accurate. A pause. To the decimal. We got lucky with the integration rate spike. We got lucky, she said, because you planned for the luck to fail and built a contingency. Another pause. That is a skill I find I have underestimated in your species. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, he kept it simple. The cordon needs to be in place within the next 4 hours, or the Keth will probe for weakness. I'll send the rotation schedule to your fleet commander. Already received, she said. Cole. Again his name, that same deliberate specificity. Well done. He looked at the tactical display. The new line held. We did well, he corrected. That's the point. The emergency session of the Conclave was not what anyone had expected. Darian had expected congratulations, some diplomatic repositioning, perhaps a formal recognition of the Terran Accord's contribution. He had not expected Seraphine Velamara to request the floor at the beginning of the session and hold it for 40 minutes. He sat in the last ring, the observer's chair, and listened. She did not describe the battle in the language of triumph. She described it in the language of audit. This is what we attempted. This is what failed. This is why it failed. This is what the Terran observer proposed. This is why it worked. This is what we should have done differently from the beginning. She named her own overconfidence. She named the cost. She named the 41 Terran personnel who had spent 2 years in Keth space gathering data that the Conclave had then ignored. She named them by individual mission designation. She had done the research. The hall was very quiet. The Terran Accord, she said, has been granted an observer seat in this conclave on the premise that they are a young species with limited capacity and minimal strategic value. I have spent this engagement discovering that this premise is precisely backward. She paused, and the gold light on her skin was steady, warm, and unashamed. They are young. They have been spacefaring for 214 years. They have also been surviving, genuinely surviving, not from a position of dominance, but through adaptation, ingenuity, and a willingness to absorb loss and continue for the entirety of their recorded history. That is not a handicap. That is, in an engagement against an adaptive enemy, the single most relevant qualification a civilization can possess. She turned and looked directly at the last ring. I propose full voting membership for the Terran Accord, effective immediately, with the understanding that this motion reflects not charity but correction of an error. She held his gaze across the distance of the hall, and he saw in that look something he wouldn't have believed possible 3 weeks ago: genuine, unguarded respect. We mocked the human strategist in this chamber. We were wrong to do so, and that wrongness cost us more than admission of error ever would have. The vote was not close. 47 in favor, 9 abstentions, 5 against, all from civilizations whose military advisors had been publicly recommending the strategy Darian had criticized, and who were now having their own difficult week. 0 opposed from the Ethon Dominion. Darian received the news on his datapad with the same expression he maintained when receiving most news: a slight shift in the set of his jaw, an increment of tension releasing from the muscles around his eyes. Ostrova, sitting nearby, noticed and asked nothing, because after 6 months working with him, she understood that he processed important things quietly, and she had learned to read the quiet. He went to find Seraphine. She was in the station's observation gallery, a long, transparent corridor that ran along the outer skin of the Conclave station, where you could see the stars without any filtering, which was something the station's Ethon architects had believed in. Occasional access to the unmediated universe, as a corrective against the tendency to confuse the conference room for the reality. She was standing at the glass with her aide dismissed and her bodyguards at a distance, which he read correctly as a request for a certain kind of conversation. He stood beside her. Neither of them looked at the other. They both looked at the stars. "You didn't have to name the 41, he said. "I know, a beat. I wanted to. That's not standard diplomatic practice." "No," she was quiet for a moment. 6 million years gives a species time to develop very elaborate practices for avoiding accountability. I have spent most of my career inside those practices. I find I'm tired of them." She paused. "I also find that accountability is considerably easier when the alternative is clearly visible." He understood what she meant. 4,000 dead, 19 ships. She had sat with those numbers every day for 3 weeks, and they had done what loss does when you let it. They had made her accurate in a way that comfort couldn't. "The cordon is holding," he said. 72-hour parameter shifts are working. The Keth haven't probed the new line. For now, he agreed. The long-term solution is a signal disruption network, permanent emitters at the node coordinates that run continuously. It won't stop the Keth, but it'll limit expansion. I've had my engineering team modeling it. It's buildable with Ethon manufacturing capacity and Terran frequency calibration. She turned to look at him then, and the gold light was doing something genuinely warm. You've already designed the next phase. The mission isn't finished. You never stop, she said, and it wasn't an accusation. It sounded, he thought, more like the particular admiration you develop for something that functions exactly as it was built to. Humans don't get to stop, he said. We're the youngest species in the galaxy. We're also, apparently, the most prepared for the next crisis. He let that sit for a moment. I think it's because we remember being afraid, not metaphorically. We haven't had 6 million years to forget what it felt like to be prey. It keeps us attentive. She was quiet for a long time. The stars outside were very bright, and very cold and very old. When I mocked you, she said, in the assembly, what did you feel? He thought about giving her the diplomatic answer. Familiar, he said instead. We've been underestimated our entire history, by our own factions before we unified, by the first alien civilizations we contacted, by every conclave session since we were admitted. He paused. You get used to it, but you don't stop noticing. And you use the underestimation. Every time. She looked at him for a long, considered moment. The Ethon, he had read, had over 2,000 nonverbal social gestures, each with specific cultural weight. What she did next was not complex. She inclined her head, a small, precise movement, chin dropping half an inch. His cultural briefing identified it as a category for acknowledgment, reserved for interactions between social equals, carrying the specific meaning of I see you and I have not always. He inclined his head in return. Not because the briefing said to, because it was the right response to something true. The permanent signal disruption network took 8 months to build. Darian managed the project from a forward station at the edge of the Keth containment corridor, which meant 8 months of sleeping in a bunk barely longer than he was tall and eating food that a Terran nutritionist had certified as adequate and a Terran chef would have certified as depressing. He didn't complain. He had never understood the appeal of complaining about conditions you chose. Seraphine visited 4 times. Each visit was formally logged as an Ethon Dominion inspection of the joint const. Ruction effort. Each visit was, in practice, something more complicated than an inspection and less complicated than whatever the obvious word for it would have been. The first visit, they walked the construction frame of the initial emitter node, and she asked technical questions that surprised him with their depth, and he asked diplomatic questions that surprised her with their directness. And they had dinner in the station's mess hall eating the same food that Darian ate every day, which she found genuinely interesting in the way that people find genuinely interesting the things they've never had to think about before. The second visit, she brought a Terran language module and had been studying it, not the standard trade tongue they'd been using through translators, but actual primary Terran, a gesture so unexpectedly personal that he was quiet for a full 3 seconds before responding, which she understood somehow correctly. She said 3 sentences to him in Terran, halting, accent not quite right, but accurate, and the sentences were, I reviewed the construction timeline. You are ahead of schedule. That surprises no one. He taught her 4 more Terran sentences that weren't in the module. The third visit, a Keth probe tested the new northern emitter array, and the alert protocol brought them both to the command station at 300. They stood side by side at the tactical display while the automated systems handled the probe, and the emitters performed exactly as designed, and the Keth withdrew. After the alert stood down, they remained in the command station and talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with military strategy, about Ethon history, about Terran literature, about what it felt like to be the oldest consciousness in a room full of ancient civilizations, and what it felt like to be the youngest. Neither of them slept. Neither of them mentioned that they weren't sleeping. The fourth visit, the network went fully online. 27 emitters, positioned across the 14 coordinates they'd identified as the Keth's primary integration nodes, running continuous signal disruption on a frequency rotation that Darian's team had designed to be unpredictable, and that the Keth had no record of encountering before. The Keth couldn't learn from it because it didn't repeat. It was, in the technical language of the engineering report, an adaptive counter-adaptive countermeasure. In the language Darian used when he explained it to Seraphine, we made a thing that confuses the thing that learns. The network went online at 1400 station time. By 1600, the Keth expansion front had retracted another half-light year. By the end of the day, the monitoring feeds showed a Keth mass that was, for the first time in 4 years, static. Not defeated, static. Which was, given the available options, a significant victory. Seraphine was standing at the observation port of the forward station when the final data confirmed. The same posture she'd had at the Conclave gallery months ago, straight, still, looking outward. But the light on her skin was different. Warm gold, steady and unperformed. "You did this," she said. "The network," he stood beside her, the same configuration as the observation gallery. "Terran engineering, Ethon manufacturing, Conclave resources. We did this." "The Conclave changed because of you," she said. "Not just the network, the assembly procedure, the outer ring representation reform, the joint military protocol that 15 species have now signed." She paused. "The Terran Accord arrived 2 weeks ago at this station with full voting membership, a seat on the Security Council, and 2 permanent construction contracts. That is not the same as the observer's chair in the last ring." "It's a start," he said. She turned to look at him. The gold light was warm and direct, and doing several things his cultural briefing had not fully prepared him for. "You know," she said, "in 600 years of diplomatic service, I have never apologized to anyone in an open assembly session." "I know," he said. "That is not a thing Ethon do." "I noticed that, yes." "I did it because it was right," she said. "And because—" She paused, and he recognized the pause. It was the pause of someone choosing honesty over the easier available options. "Because you had earned it. And because I think that what your species has, that refusal to stop, that ability to carry loss and keep building, I think the rest of us have been so old for so long that we have forgotten that it is the most important quality in the universe." She looked back at the stars. "We have been optimal for 6 million years. You have been persistent for 214. And persistence," she said very quietly, "wins." Darian looked at the stars alongside her. 214 years, against 6 million. The smallest species in the galaxy, assigned to the last ring of the last chamber of the F. Erst body that had deigned to notice them. And now, a network of permanent emitters built by Ethon hands to Terran specifications, holding back an enemy that had consumed everything the galaxy had thrown at it for 4 years. He thought about 41 names. He thought about 4,312. He thought about the observer's chair against the back wall, and the vote with 47 in favor, and 3 sentences in halting Terran spoken in a forward station mess hall by someone who didn't have to learn them. "It does," he agreed. A year after the Velserath engagement, a monument was erected in the Conclave station's central atrium. Monuments were not common at the Conclave. The architecture was generally understood to be statement enough. But the joint commission that proposed the structure had been unanimous, which was rare enough to be notable, and the design had been developed collaboratively, which was rarer still. It was not large. It was not elaborate. It was a column of Ethon coral stone, grown rather than carved, rising to head height, into which 41 names had been set in Terran script, and then duplicated in 40 other languages, one for each represented civilization in the network coalition. Beside the Terran names, in slightly larger script, were 4 words that Seraphine had proposed and that the commission had adopted without amendment. They went first, we followed. Darian stood at the monument on the dedication day with Seraphine beside him and the assembled conclave around them. He looked at the 41 names for a long time. He did not cry, not because he didn't feel it, but because there are forms of grief that express themselves as resolve rather than tears, and that was the form that had built him. He felt Seraphine's hand, four-fingered, luminescent at the palm, settle briefly at his shoulder. It was not a diplomatic gesture. He knew all her diplomatic gestures by now. This was something else. "I have been thinking," she said quietly for him, About what you told me. About humans not getting to stop. Yes. I think, she said, that we have stopped. Or we slowed, in ways we did not recognize as stopping. 6 million years, and we built and refined and accumulated, and somewhere in the accumulation, we forgot how to be afraid in the useful way. The way that makes you careful. The way that makes you send scouts. You haven't forgotten, he said. You're learning it again. She looked at the monument. With assistance. That's how it works, he said. Nobody figures everything out alone. Not civilizations, not species. He paused. The thing about being young is you know you have things left to learn. The thing about being old is you forget you still do. She was quiet for a moment. Is that wisdom, or is that something a 21st century human philosopher said? Both, probably, he said. Most of the best things are. The dedication ceremony continued around them. The voices of 61 civilizations, representatives cycling through acknowledgments in their own languages. Darian listened to pieces of it, a Vreth formal recitation, the low harmonic of Murren's ceremonial speech, something from the Quilith that his translator identified as a blessing, and that sounded like a river. He thought about the observer's chair in the last ring. He thought about the seat on the Security Council. He thought about a 40-page analysis that had been filed and ignored, and then the moment when its core prediction came true to the decimal, and the assembly vote that followed, and the monument that stood here now with 41 names in 41 languages. He thought about 214 years against 6 million, and he thought, with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who had never needed the world to agree with him in order to be right, that the math was starting to change. The galaxy had spent a long time deciding what humanity was worth. Humanity had spent that time building the tools to demonstrate it. He looked at Seraphine. The gold light on her skin was warm and steady in the atrium's soft illumination, and she was looking at the monument with an expression he had come to recognize over a year of forward stations and mess hall conversations, and 300 alerts and 4 visits and 3 sentences in halting Terran. The expression of someone who is genuinely, permanently awake. Next session, she said without looking at him, the Aquari Federation is presenting a motion on deep space territorial rights. I've read their proposal. A pause. It's flawed. I've read it too, he said. I suspect you've already written the amendment. 2 weeks ago. She turned to look at him, and the gold light was warm and amused and something beyond both. Of course you have, she said. Would you like to co-sponsor it? She held his gaze for a moment. 6 million years of evolution and diplomacy and accumulated Jew. DG looked at 214 years of survival and adaptation, and stubborn, relentless forward motion. Yes, she said, I would. They stood at the monument a little longer, in the light of 41 names in 41 languages, while 61 civilizations continued the ceremony around them, and the galaxy turned, and the Keth network held, and the Terran Accord's seat on the Security Council remained occupied by a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. He had only needed to be right. And patient. And willing, always, to go first.